Hello, happy Saturday. I'm going to tell a story before it gets too busy and noisy here in my little neighborhood. We had a light frost last night, but everything is dewy and green this morning. It's a lovely morning. I hope wherever you are, whether it's morning or afternoon or evening, you are well. I was inspired by a series of videos on Facebook by a Scottish fiddler named Elsa McTaggart, who's based on the Isle of Lewis. She's on Facebook, you can check her out. She's doing a tune a day, and while I'm not ready to commit to a story a day, I can offer a story a week. And so here's a story. It comes from the island of Barra, which is one of the Outer Hebridean islands, Lewis being at the north, and Barra being at the southern end of that spray and array of islands. It was told to me by a storyteller, an oral tradition bearer named Morag MacNeil back in 1997, and this would be my honoring and praise to Morag's story and the good folk of Barra. Once upon a time, at the very edge of the great North Atlantic, in a village, there lived a little girl named Catriona. And Catriona lived with her sister, Morag, and they didn't have much. Their chickens weren't laying eggs. Their cow wasn't giving milk. Their potatoes were not ready and too wee to eat. So they often went to bed hungry. And everyone in the village was pretty much in the same boat. Occasionally they had some fish, but it wasn't much and it wasn't enough. So now everyone on the island knew that at the very top of the hill, the mountain, there lived a great giant. And everyone knew that this giant took from all the islands. He took food, he took crops, and he stored them all away in his gigantic home. So Catriona thought perhaps she could go and ask the giant if he would share some with her or some with her village. And her sister said, "No, Catriona, you can't go up and ask the giant for food. You don't know what will happen." And Catriona said, "I'm not afraid." And so she grabbed a wee sack and she kissed her sister goodbye and she said, "I'll see you soon." And away up the great slope of the mountain she went. And as she went, she greeted her friends, the wild thyme, the tormentil, the bog asphodel, and of course the heather and the bracken. She made her way higher and higher until she could look out and almost see the whole of Barra around her. And eventually she came to the giant's house, and the door was open just a crack. And now where Catriona came from in the village, you didn't bother knocking on your neighbor's door. So Catriona pushed the door open and it gave a mighty squeak. And she stepped in. "Hello? Hello?" she said. And her little voice was lost in the immensity of the giant's great house, sort of like hearing a mouse squeak in a dance hall. And she made her way in, and her eyes grew wide as saucers as she noticed how large everything was. This giant must be huge. And he was. So she made her way, and her nose led her straight to the kitchen. And there was a great cupboard, a door. Not the size of our cupboard doors, but something larger. And she knew if she opened it, she would find the food because she could smell it. So she didn't have much strength from not having eaten well for too long. But she used all of her strength and she tried to open that door. And she pulled and she pulled. And at one point she even stopped and cried. She was so close. But she didn't give up. She grabbed onto the handle, and with one great heave, calling on the memory of her mother and her father who had passed on, she heaved open the door. And inside, food, shelves and shelves of food, great sacks of oats and potatoes, great bowls and baskets of eggs and apples, wheels of cheese, jars of honeycomb. And so, Catriona helped herself to just a bit. Surely, who would miss what she would take when there was so much? And so she took a few handfuls of flour and a few potatoes and a few eggs and a few apples, which would be like candy to her, and some honeycomb. And she tucked it all into the sack. And then she said a blessing of thanks for this great storehouse of food, and to the giant. And she stepped out of the cupboard and made her way out of the giant's house. And she opened the door, and it gave another great squeak. And she left it as she found it. And she was just stepping under the lintel into that fresh, moist air when she heard a voice. "Hey, you!" It was the giant, and he was up in a window upstairs looking down at her. "Come back here with my food," said the giant. Catriona, she wasn't sure what to do. She panicked a bit. She should have just stopped, she thought, but she was afraid. So she ran. She ran down the mountainside, and she was fleet, and she was fly. And the giant, he jumped out the window and started chasing Catriona. And she could feel him behind her. The whole ground shook beneath her feet as she ran down the mountain. Now, just before she came to the village, there's a wee stream. Not so wee, big enough that there needed to be a bridge. Now, she knew from old stories that she had heard from her grandmother and her mother that giants couldn't cross running water. It's just some beautiful magical law. And so she ran over the bridge, and she looked back and she saw the giant arrive at the edge of the stream, confounded, because he knew he couldn't cross, because giants and witches just can't. But he warned her off. He said, "If I ever see you again, I will eat you for my supper." Catriona ran, and she ran all the way back to her small home, a little hut. And her sister was so grateful to see her. And she saw the sack bulging with food. And Catriona took it out. The eggs and the apples, nothing had broken. The oats and the flour and the bit of cheese and the bit of honeycomb. And her sister said, "Oh, Catriona, we'll eat well for a month at least." And so they did. They managed to make that food last. And they always had plenty. They always had enough. And at night their bellies were full and they slept well. And by the end of the month they had roses in their cheeks and their eyes sparkled the way all children's eyes should sparkle. But the food was gone. So Catriona said, "I'm going back." And Marad said, "Oh no, Catriona, you heard what the giant had said to you. If he catches you, he's going to eat you." "Well, I'm not afraid," said Catriona. So she grabbed the sack and she made her way over the bridge and up the mountainside. And again, it was a fine day, and as she walked higher and higher, she greeted her friends, the plant friends and the little insects that she saw, all her friends. And she made her way eventually up to the giant's house. And just as before, the door was open just a crack. She pressed it open and it gave a great squeak, and she waited. She stepped in and she called out, "Hello? Hello?" But no one answered. So this time she didn't pause to look at all the gigantic furnishings around her. She made straight for the kitchen and straight for that door. And because she had been eating well, she was strong, and it took one great pull, and she opened it. And inside, if possible, there was even more food. So, as before, she took enough. A bit of flour, a bit of oats, a bit of cheese, some eggs, some apples, potatoes, a bit of honeycomb, a few neeps, and she tucked it into the sack. And she gave her blessing of thanks. She was just tiptoeing out of the kitchen when, "Now I've got you!" And the giant, he grabbed Catriona and he stuffed her into a sack. And he took that sack into another room and he hung it on a hook on the wall. He said, "Now I've got you." "Oh," said the giant, "I will eat well this evening. But first I must go and get some wood to make a fire so I can eat like a king." And out the giant went. Well, Catriona had been caught. There she was, stuffed in a sack, hanging from a hook on a wall in the middle of a giant's house at the top of a mountain. Well, she thought there was nothing for it. She might as well be jolly about it. So she began to sing a wee song about going to heaven. And she sang her wee song with all of her heart. And she thought about seeing her mother and her father and her grandmother and her grandfather and all the folks she knew that lived there. And at some point, as she sang as sweet as a bird, she heard a voice. "Oh, can I go to heaven too?" said the voice. And Catriona wondered, who? And then she remembered. Sure, didn't the giant live with his old mother? Oh, she was so old, they say, she hadn't left her bed for 10 years. Can you imagine? That was almost as long as Catriona had been alive. This must be the giant's mother. So Catriona, being clever, she said, "Well, I hear you. If you want to go to heaven, then you'll have to get out of bed and let me out of this sack, and then you can go to heaven too." She waited. And she heard the fluff of 10 woolen blankets being lifted. She heard the crack and pop and creak of the old woman's bones as she clambered out of the bed. She heard the stomp, stomp of the giantess's feet on the floor as they came closer and closer to where Catriona hung on the wall. And then Catriona felt herself being lifted down. And the old woman opened up the sack, her eyes as big as saucers, her face a road map of wrinkles. And each one was a great story. And Catriona looked up. She said, "Hello. Kimmerahau, which means, how are you? The old woman said, Ha, miski, I'm tired, and I want to go to heaven. So Catriona said, well, you help me out of the sack, and then you'll climb in, and you can go to heaven. All right. So Catriona climbed out of the sack, and it was some negotiation, but the old woman managed to get one foot in the sack and another, and the sack seemed to accommodate this giant old woman, and Catriona helped pull it up, climbing up on a dresser to pull it up over the old woman's head and secure the rope on that loop. And then Catriona ran. She sped down the hill. Now, when she got down the hill, down the mountain, there's that stream, that river. And she knew the giant couldn't cross it, but she wasn't sure if he'd find some clever way to get across and find her. So they gathered up the bridge completely in case he thought maybe he would try and cartwheel right over the bridge on his fingertips or something. They took the bridge down, and Catriona ran home safe. Now, back up at the giant's home, he was just coming in with a great load of wood. He set it down and he looked at the sack. When he left, it was just a wee sack full of that delicious little girl. But now it was big. It was huge. She had grown. Well, he'd eat well for a whole week, indeed. And he took the sack off the hook and he began to swing it around, back and forth, singing about this great supper that he would eat. And then he heard a voice. Stop! Stop! It's your mother! Let me out! As he swung it back and forth, and he said, Sure, it's my mother. And he just thought it was Catriona teasing him. And he swung it, and then the giant looked in the bed where his own mother had been living for the last 10 years. And he stopped. And he opened up the sack. And he saw his mother in the sack. Oh, he said. And he helped his mother out, gentle. And he helped her over to the bed. And the old woman said, Oh, but I want to go to heaven too. And her son said, Oh, and you will, when it's time. And he kissed his mother on the cheek, and he covered her up with the 9 layers of blankets. And then, only then, did the giant let his anger spill from his ears, rise up through his mass of red hair, as he went to the window to see if he could see Catriona, but he couldn't. So he ran out of the house and he went stomping down the side of the mountain. Indeed, that day the folk of Barra thought there was an earthquake. So much did the ground tremble from the great giant's tread. And when the giant reached the river, he thought he'd find a way to cross that bridge and defy those magical laws. But the bridge was gone. So the giant couldn't cross, and Catriona got away. Now, I like to think that shortly after that, Catriona's chickens started laying eggs, and their cow giving milk, and their potatoes grew fat and floury. And that one dark night, Catriona gathered a little sack of their own food, and she wandered up the mountain, accompanied by the moon and the stars. And she left a little sack for the giant and for his mother. So that's it. And when Morag finished the story, as so many of the folk that I heard stories from did, she said, Shenagate, which means that's it. Thank you. Have a lovely rest of your Saturday. Cheery.